The second phase of the medieval is the Romanesque. And what does Romanesque mean? It means in the Roman style. So, esque on the end of a word typically means in the style of something. So, this is Romanesque in the style of the Romans. We mentioned before when talking about the Holy Roman Empire that even though we're talking about more Northern European peoples now, that there's still a huge influence that Rome is playing and then a lot of these leaders are still looking to Rome as far as, guidance with politics or art styles, right? So this continues, right, into this phase of the medieval as well. And I think the sort of thematic for me when I think of the Romanesque is pilgrimage and its products, right? What kind of pilgrimage principles are going on here, and what kind of products or art pieces, right, are being created to complement, right, the pilgrimage that's happening at this time. Now, to set you up, thinking about the time period, right? We're still in the same general geographic location. So we're up in Northern Europe. I showed you this map last time, and we talked a little bit about how these governments are going to be more regional, right? In characteristic, they're going to be smaller, more regional, not these broad empires like the Roman Empire or the Persian Empire. And the rough dates that you're seeing for this time are about 900 to about 1200 AD. And one of the dates I want you to be thinking about that's in here is the year 1000. The idea of the millennium is going to be very important to these people. So, again, think about that in the context of Romanesque. Um, what is happening at this time, right? This is the height of what we call the feudal or the manor system. Feudal system, I'm sure you've heard before, maybe not manor system. Manor system comes as another title for the system from the idea that the small group of people who are holding power at this time, right? What we'd call the wealthy landowners. These wealthy landowners probably made up only about 10% of the population, but had all the power. And so they'd own giant tracts of land, and typically on the middle of that land would be a manor house, almost in a sense, this manor house that could look out onto the land and see everything else that was going on, right? That was spreading out, right? From the home. I always think of the home, the manor, like a hub on a wheel, and all the land kind of like the spokes of the wheel, kind of radiating out. So that's always kind of a visual that's in my mind when I think of the manor home, right? And how it would have functioned. Or even you can look into the idea of the panopticon, this idea in prisons that if you make a circular prison where the guards are in the middle, but the prisoners can never see them, there's always this idea that the prisoners don't know if they're being watched or not. So it's this insidious kind of use of control and power over the people around you when you use sort of this circular system of control, right? Either thinking about it like a wheel, or again, you can look at the panopticon and see how that works. The feudal system, as I mentioned, about 10% of the people held power, and then everybody else worked for them. I'm sure you've heard the term peasantry, right? Or serfs, right? For the lower classes, right, which was about 90% of the people who were working the land for these very wealthy people. The image you're seeing here gives you a actual visual of what we call the three classes, right, of medieval society. And you see here on the left a poem from the time that basically talks about kind of, I would say, how does this ideology work, right? How were people convinced that the feudal system was something that they should be okay with, right? How do you create a class structure that 90% of the people are basically held down, and how do you make it work? Well, you make it work by saying that everybody is intertwined, right? Everybody relies on each other, that you need the peasants to feed you, but you need the manor lords to give you guidance and strength, and you need the church to give you religious strength, right? So if you look at the image, you'll see on the left you have a monk, so he's representing the church structure, might we say. And you can recognize him because he has a tonsor, he has his hair shaved, and then there's this kind of ring of hair around the outside, and that's the typical way that monks wore their hair at the time. In the middle, you have a knight. We'll talk a little bit more about the Crusades in a minute, but the knights would have represented the manor lords or the manor homes, because typically what would happen in a manor family is based on the amount of sons you had, children you had, right? And the sons were the ones who would have inherited the property. The first son would have been the inheritor. The second son would have became a knight to go off to fight in the Crusades. And then the third son usually went into monastery or became a monk, right? So this is how these families dealt with kind of the descent of power, right? If you had more than one son, what do you do with them? So a knight in this case represents very much visually the manor families, right? And then finally on the right you have the serf. And you could tell that he's a serf because he's wearing like really plain clothes and he's holding a garden implement, right? He's holding a shovel, right? A hoe, right? So he's holding that in his hand. Now, this idea was that, again, all these classes were intertwined with one another and they couldn't exist, separate, right, from one another. So you had to have this sense that you're all in it together. And that's how it works, right? They would even use what we call a bodily metaphor. They would say that the manor lord, or the knight in this case, would be like the brains of the operation, right? The head. The monk was like the heart. Religion was like the heart of the people. And then finally the serfs were like the feet. They were the physicality, right? They were taking all the abuse. So this idea that you wouldn't abuse your feet or your hands if you wanted to eat, right? Just like you wouldn't neglect the intellect of knowing what you should do. So, and everybody needs heart, right? So again, it's like a bodily metaphor with each class kind of assigned to a different part of the body. So again, it's a very entwined kind of social structure. And then we talked about how syncretism was often used by early medieval people, especially people coming in to Christianize this region to convince people of what they wanted, right? What they wanted them to do. In this case, Norse mythology pops up again, and it comes from the story of Rig, or the creator god. And in the story of Rig, it's said that he went to the different households, the different classes of his people. So he went to like the peasant's house, he went to like an upper class person's house. And in the story, he knocks on the door and he's sort of like, "Hey there, can I spend the night?" Which back in this day wouldn't have been an odd thing. Travelers often would come to your door and ask for shelter. And the family would be like, "Oh, okay, yeah, come on in." So the farmers would be like, "Yeah, come on in, come on in." And then it said that he was like, "Oh, I'll just sleep here in between you, in between like the husband and the wife." And they're like, "Okay, it's a little weird, but you can sleep between us." And then in the morning, they'd wake up and Rig would be gone, but there'd be a baby between them. So in the Norse story, it's this idea that like all the classes were created by the gods. That Rig comes to their houses in a sense, makes offspring within each class structure to say this is given by the god, right? So again, people who wanted the feudal system work would look even at people who were sort of slightly still pagan and say, well, hey, though, your own mythology says this, so class structure is not a bad thing. So again, just a little bit of background. The feudal system is very important to how this era operates. Everything is either done for the church or for your manor lord. There's no sense of autonomy or independence. So we live a very autonomous, independent existence, I think, in the current time. And we have to understand that these people were more communal, right? They were very much about the community, they were about the interdependency of their people. They were not autonomous. They weren't like, this is about me. Like that rarely happened, right, for these people. And it's important to recognize that. The church was also, again, a very important guiding force for these people. And church architecture becomes really important. And the role of pilgrimage, of course, becomes very important as well. So, what happens during this time is we see a lot of building of pilgrimage churches, right? These huge, massive churches that pilgrims were going to come visit. And I'm going to talk to you more about Saint Saturnin here in a bit, but I want you to think about the church kind of as the heart of the community, right? That the church became sort of the heart of the community and everything else spread out from it, right? And pilgrimage became big business, as we were talking about back in the Byzantine, where you have these monastic communities and then you have these church communities that want to have relics and objects that you can come see. Because again, it helps support them financially as well as being kind of a point of faith. So it works both ways, right, for these people. These pilgrimage routes were highly complex. You can notice how they basically snaked across northern Europe into northern Spain. I'm sorry, through France, Germany into northern Spain. And the conclusion point was Santiago de Compostela that you see down here, right in Spain. And Santiago de Compostela was related to Saint James. So you could pick your different pilgrimage route. You'll also see all the ships coming from England, from Southampton, from London, right? Here they would come into port. You could pick your journey and travel through these various churches and see various relics. But typically, what you would want to do is end up in de Compostela. They call this the Compostela Trail, right? Today, it's the Camino Trail, as they call it. So people today still go walk the Camino, as they call it, and do this journey, either on foot or like on horseback or donkey back, and sort of try to trace the idea of the pilgrimage routes, right, that these Romanesque people would have taken, these medieval people, right, would have come into contact with. I love the art of the pilgrimage routes over here on the side because it tells you like, what kind of things you could have seen there. So you can go out and like, oh, shards, you could have seen mosaics. Oh, that's cool, right? Oh, you can see paintings here, and it gives you a sense of what all these different churches had to offer you. Like, did they have a relic? Did they have, enamels? Did they have fresco? So these people would travel along the Compostela or around on the Camino route, right? They would pick their journey. In the art, you can see these different people on the journey. People wearing shells, that was the shell of St. James. So you can see different churches where people were wearing the shell, basically saying they were on the Camino route or going to Compostela. Um, so again, this pilgrimage idea is very important. They go see relics, they go see churches, and of course, we're going to talk more about those objects. Another item of discussion you have to consider is the Crusades and the impact of the Crusades during this period. The Crusades were occurring between Christians and Muslims, mainly over Muslims taking over the Holy Lands, right, and most of Spain during this time. Because if you look at that pilgrimage route map, you'll notice that Spain kind of cuts off right at the top as far as pilgrimage routes. That's because the bottom half of Spain was being controlled by Muslims at this time. And, Christians waged this as what they call a holy war or a holy battle, in a sense. If we look at it through the lens of military history, like most battles, it really came to not much at all. There were like, five different waves, right? Some people argue about how many exact waves. Some people don't count the Children's Crusades. Um, but on this map, you can see the different waves of the Crusades being charted out, right? Again, it was really a battle over the Holy Lands. So we'll go down here, look at this, the area of the Holy Lands, right? You see Jerusalem, Bethlehem, right? And again, trying to reclaim the area of Spain, right? That was not being controlled by, Muslims at this time or Christians at this time. So again, this is to me an ideological battle, and a lot of war is ideology. It's like, I don't think like you think. But at the end of the day, I'd say this, did little to nothing to advance Christianity or advance Islam, right, one way or the other. Um, Christianity Christianity predominantly became European, and Islam became, of course, predominantly Middle Eastern and Asian. So that's kind of how things still are. Um, so again, the Crusades, you have to consider the impact. And why I bring this up is because a lot of holy relics were in the Holy Lands, and many Crusaders felt that they had to go secure these relics, right, and bring them back to Europe, to Christian territory. Now, if you know your Islamic history, of course, you know that Islam is another variation on Abrahamic religion, that Jews, Christians, and Muslims, of course, are interconnected in their belief structures. Their foundation is the same. Where they differ, of course, is their prophets, and their beliefs. But their foundation is a shared, what we call Abrahamic heritage. So I often find it kind of funny, right, that there's so much squabbling, right, between the two religions and what comes of it, right, at the end of the day. But that's me speaking as a religious scholar, I suppose. The final thing I want to mention, of course, is the role of the millennium and the year 1000 in the minds of these people, because these were Christians, very staunch Christians. And so their belief very much was that the last judgment was close at hand. As the year 1000 came closer and closer, their belief was that, the end of the world was coming, the last judgment was going to arrive. And so they have a lot of what I call millennial angst. Um, I was in one of my graduate programs when Y2K happened in 2000, and I remember everybody just sort of flipping their lids, right? And being like, the world's going to end, computers are going to kill us, right? Planes will fall from the sky. And I'm a historian, so I'm just like, yeah, nothing's going to happen. And people are like, but we need to stock up on. I'm like, yeah, nothing's going to happen. I can look back at the Romanesque and tell you, it's not going to happen, right? And then nothing happened. So, as a historian, I was like, okay, yeah, this is sort of how it is. But again, fear and panic are powerful forces, right, for people. It's hard for them to think rationally when fear sets in, right? And to them, the Last Judgment, as Christians, it was something they were looking forward to, but at the same time, it's sort of a scary event, like what will happen, what will go on, how will you be judged? And so you see a lot more Last Judgment imagery emerging on churches at this time. And with that, I'll mention, think about it. Now we're seeing the decoration of the exterior of churches going to start. This really happens very firmly in the Romanesque, and we think it's because they wanted to have almost, in a sense, these billboards on the outside of churches saying, the end is nigh, right? So again, we'll think a little bit about this as we look at the art pieces.